groundswell that began in Egypt days ago has reached a critical point. In Cairo and other major cities, the protesters show no sign of backing down. There is a large military presence on the streets, but so far the army appears to be leaving people alone. The police have now retreated, but clashes with protesters have left more than 70 dead and more than 1,000 injured. In an effort to calm the situation, the target of all this fury, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, named a new vice president today, a position that has never existed during his 30 years in power. NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel was out on the streets for us again today, and he joins us tonight from Cairo. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Kate. If President Mubarak thought that making some minor concessions, changing his government, naming a vice president, if he thought this would stop the protests, well, then he badly miscalculated. Today were the biggest demonstrations yet.
The Egyptian government now seems teetering on collapse. It's never lost control like this before. Today, tens of thousands of protesters converged on Cairo's main square. The police were no longer on the streets today, so unopposed, the demonstrators had the run of Cairo. In the square, it was mostly peaceful, the mood jubilant. The crowds were claiming victory after yesterday's fierce battles between protesters and riot police. Egyptians today awoke to assess the damage. It's extensive. Parts of this city on the Nile are starting to look like the city on the Tigris, Baghdad.
This was the headquarters of President Mubarak's political party. Until recently, it was one of the most secured buildings in Cairo. Now, it's being burned and picked apart by looters.
The fires in Cairo still smolder today, dangerously close to the famous Egyptian Museum, home to the treasures of the ancient pharaohs, including Tutankhamun's gold. There's already been some damage, but the Egyptian army has taken up positions at the museum to protect it. By mid-afternoon, the protests started to grow. With police gone, only the army was in the streets, in tanks. But tanks aren't built to hold back crowds. They can only do one thing, fire. But the big guns have so far remained silent.
The Egyptian army has been completely overwhelmed by the demonstrators. Now the soldiers face a very difficult choice. They can either open fire on the protesters or just allow themselves to be surrounded.
The government ordered a new curfew, but no one listened. Instead, in Cairo's main Tahrir Square, what looked like 100,000 people called for President Hosni Mubarak to leave the country immediately.
We want change. We want Mr. Mubarak to leave and give room for other people.
This may be the day's most iconic image. Protesters standing on tanks, surrounded by supporters, taking pictures with their cell phones.
Although the army is now in the streets, they are certainly taking no actions against the protesters. In fact, the soldiers here seem to be siding with the demonstrators.
We even saw soldiers cheering alongside the demonstrators. But who are the protesters? By now, they're everybody. Young men who want jobs, Egyptians tired of corruption and repressive rule, families who decry the poor education system, and increasingly Islamic fundamentalists who want a greater role for Islamic law. Mubarak has kept Islamic parties under an iron fist for decades. With each day of the protests, the Islamic influence is increasingly obvious. President Mubarak today made good on a promise from last night. He reshuffled his government and appointed his intelligence chief as vice president. The protesters immediately called it window dressing and said it's not enough. But there's another, much darker side to this revolt. Mob rule is starting to set in. As the demonstrations continue, there's widespread looting in Cairo's wealthy suburbs. 17 police stations in Cairo have been ransacked and their weapons stolen. Foreigners are leaving as fast as they can. The pyramids have been closed to tourists. As Mubarak clings to power, but appears to have lost control of the streets.
Tonight, many Egyptians have formed vigilante groups. They are standing armed with whatever they can, sticks, knives, in some case weapons, in front of their homes, trying to protect their communities from looters. Kate?
Richard, those images of people standing on top of the tanks, and I know you've said there may be even some foot soldiers heading out. Tell us about that, and also how real is the possibility that the military simply takes over the functions of the government?
We have been told by witnesses that some ground soldiers are on their way. We saw today tanks on the street. They had almost no impact, but we are told that regular Egyptian soldiers will be deploying to downtown Cairo. And according to many Egyptians, this is a plot. This is an attempt to get the people to come out and support the army. Whether that is the case or not is difficult to know, but Egyptians expect there will be soldiers on the streets tomorrow, and if these soldiers are embraced, that could be setting the groundwork for an army takeover.
Richard Engel in Cairo again tonight. Stand by for us. We'll check back with you later in the broadcast. For 3 decades, President Mubarak has been an ally of the United States. The U.S. sends well over $1 billion in military aid to Egypt every year. Not surprisingly, the Obama administration is reacting cautiously to the protests. NBC's Mike Vaquera is at the White House tonight. Mike?
Good evening, Kate. Today, the White House issued another call for restraint in Egypt, while also insisting that the time for reform within the Egyptian government is now. Outside the White House,
stop dictating, more dictators.
A few dozen protesters gathered in a show of solidarity with the tens of thousands in the streets of Cairo. Inside, the president met with top members of his foreign policy team after speaking with President Mubarak by phone Friday night, and publicly urging him to enact immediate reforms.
What's needed right now are concrete steps that advance the rights of the Egyptian people, a meaningful dialogue between the government and its citizens.
Mubarak's move to oust his entire cabinet did not go far enough for the administration. A State Department spokesman tweeting, "The Egyptian government can't reshuffle the deck and then stand pat." But while the president has sided with the protesters in their call for greater freedoms, he has stopped short of backing their demand for Mubarak's ouster.
If Mubarak is going to survive, then the United States can't do too much to antagonize him, because he is going to be our partner, hopefully, going forward. On the other hand, if the administration believes that his days are numbered, that the revolution is going to succeed, then it can't do too much to antagonize the protesters.
Mubarak's predecessor, Anwar Sadat, made peace with Israel in 1978.
President Anwar Sadat fatally wounded.
Sadat was assassinated 3 years later, and Mubarak rose to power in the Arab world's most populous country. Since then, peace with Israel has held, providing some stability in a volatile region and drawing Egypt and the United States into what the president yesterday described as a partnership.
It affects everything the U.S. is doing on the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Gulf, and beyond that. And therefore, there are strategic consequences that the U.S. cannot afford not to watch and pay attention to, which is putting the administration under a dilemma.
And, Kate, U.S. officials estimate there are about 90,000 Americans either living or working in Egypt, along with an unknown number of tourists there at any given moment. Well, they don't think that the situation in Egypt now presents a serious threat to Americans there. They point out that there are contingency plans to evacuate Americans if the situation gets worse. Kate?
Mike Vaquera at the White House, thanks. And this program note tomorrow on Meet the Press, David Gregory.